that the Qur'an was written way after the noble prophet. And they're saying that, how do we know it's true? It's written way after. In fact, some of them, baselessly, they don't even have the evidence in their hands. They claim that 200 years after the prophet, Some say 40 years after the prophet. They come up with all these different arguments. But the reality is the Qur'an was not written after the noble prophet's death. So this is one of the biggest mistakes that people are making. The Qur'an was written at the time of the noble prophet and since the beginning. Since when the revelation started coming down, the prophet had scribes, people who wrote it down. In fact, we have very clear evidence in our hands. If we look at historical evidence, you will see that right at the beginning, when they were still in Mecca, in the story of Omer ibn al-Khattab, as you know, when he heard that his sister Fatima became a Muslim, he was very upset. He rushed to her house. In fact, he hit her, in the face. He was very angry because he was a mushrik, polytheist at the time. And then he heard them, recite the Quran. And interestingly, if you look at the narration, it says Omar asked his sister Fatima to bring the written parchment of the Quran, so he wanted to read it as well. So we know there's a parchment which the Quran was written on right in the beginning. And his sister said, no, you cannot touch it unless you go and wash yourself. It's a very famous incident. There is another big evidence when the companions of the Prophet, some of them who were being persecuted in Mecca, insulted, harassed, they faced all sorts of, tortures. The Prophet sent them to Abyssinia, Ethiopia today. A big group went to Abyssinia. They migrated there, and they took with them a written, on paper, on parchments, or we should say, they used to use the skin of, a goat or sheepskin to write things on. They took the material in their hands to Abyssinia, which the Surah Maryam was written on. Surah Maryam, as you know, because Abyssinians were Christians, and it was relevant to their beliefs, Surah Maryam, because it's about Mary and Jesus Christ. And there's evidence, clear evidence of that too. So we know that the Quran was written on different materials, parchments and other materials as well, at the time of the Prophet. What confuses these people when they say Quran was written after the Prophet? They are talking about the compilation of the Quran. So the Quran was made into a book format after the Prophet's death, but only a year after the Prophet's death. Only a year. All the written materials were there. There were many people who had already memorized the entire Quran. It was in their memories anyway, but there were also written materials. At the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he is the first caliph, as you know. A year into his caliphate, 1 year after the Prophet's death, Omar ibn al-Khattab said, there are many Hafizes who are losing their life, they're dying, we don't want this Quran lost, we should put it into a book format. And Abu Bakr agreed, and they made it into a book format, the Mus'af, they put it together, first time. But the parchments were there already. See, that's what the people are getting confused. And then they come up and ask questions like, why didn't the Prophet did this? Why didn't he make it into a book format? Well, the revelation was continuing. So the Prophet could not have said, make it into a book format, because the book is not completed yet. It's still continuing. So after the Prophet's death, they decided to collect everything, put it together, and they made it into a book format, and they gave it to the trust, or they entrusted upon Hafsa, who was Omer's daughter, and also the Prophet's wife, and she kept it for safekeeping. They gave it to her. And then 13, 14 years later, at the time of Osman, the third Khalifa, he took that original copy from Hafsa and he made additional 7 copies of it. And he sent it to various centers of the Islamic world so people can make their copies from the original formats, standardize the Quran. But there are, some historical evidence that at the time of Osman, hundreds of Qurans were written from the originals because they were sent to the armies, they were sent to the various locations. So the claim that the Quran was written after the Prophet's death, it is wrong. It was written throughout the Prophet's life, but it was compiled into a book format 1 year approximately after the Prophet's death.